Weyanoke Elementary opened in 1949. It's named for a nearby neighborhood.
The Weyanoke neighborhood was built in the 1920s.
The neighborhood and its streets were named for Native American Indian tribes. We say Weyanoke, but the Weyanoke people pronounced it a little differently.
They lived in Virginia a long time ago.
This is their story.
The Weyanock, and that's how you pronounce it, not Weyanoke. The Weyanock people were folks who lived on the middle reach of the James River. They had their own chief, but they were subject to a greater chief, a paramount chief, that most people have heard of in this world because he had a famous daughter. The man was Powhatan and the daughter was Pocahontas. So the Weyanocks were officially the subjects of Pocahontas' daddy, who ruled all of eastern Virginia, from Richmond, Fredericksburg, Washington, eastward down those rivers. 400 years ago, eastern Virginia looked somewhat different than it does now, and looked quite different from anything that Europeans or urban Americans today were accustomed to. For one thing, it is a world of water and land interspersed, interlaced, if you like. The Indians lived in their canoes. Not nearly as much land had been cleared for farming. The Indians were farmers, but there weren't as many Indians. So the place looked like a wilderness to the English who arrived, and if we had a time machine, it would look pretty much like a wilderness to us.
Here the rivers flow down from the white sands and through the plains and into the bay. Never have heaven and earth come together to form a more perfect place for habitation. Here, a man with his freedom and good wit and hard work may make a fortune quickly.
The Europeans, and we still today, tend to see water as a barrier. It's a boundary. Counties and cities often have rivers and creeks as their edges, as their boundaries. In the Indian world, it was the reverse. Creeks and rivers were the center of territories. These were people who did most of their traveling by canoe, and canoes being like our minivans, you carry everything heavy in your canoe, you take it down the roadway, which is actually a waterway. When a river was really, really broad, like the Potomac at its mouth, then you would have separate tribes living on each side, though they were often friends. But when you got to a narrower part of the river, such as the Potomac up around Fairfax County, and also the James River where the Weyanocks lived, there the river was narrow enough and the paddling across was short enough that they simply considered both sides to be their territory. And we see records about 2 Weyanock towns on Captain John Smith's map. And that's because it was the same people. It was basically the same town.
My name is Mike Barber with the Department of Historic Resources. I'm the state archaeologist. We're here in Richmond in the Virginia Artifact Collection Room, where we have artifacts which are used for educational purposes. In the back, we have another 6.5 million artifacts. Right now we're going to look at some sewing tools that are like those that may have been used at the Weyanoke village site. Here's probably a typical earlier arrow point. And once you got to almost to the contact period, you started seeing these arrow points that were like this. So progressively gotten smaller. And in fact, as they reduced in size, they were more effective because they had a better penetrating ability. I have an example here of a tool that was used for digging, basically a hoe. Originally, archaeologists thought that it was hafted like this and was used as an axe. But you can see from the wear patterns on these things Most of them were hafted like this, if this is the handle, and they were used in digging. And you can see the wear pattern along the edge, where this edge is smooth from the friction of digging in the ground, and this edge is not. So again, a hoe-like motion to dig up roots and things of that sort. Now this is the drawer that holds a lot of the bone tools. This is my favorite kind of stuff. This is a very common tool during the late woodland times, and this is the lower leg bone of a white-tailed deer. Probably don't know it, but deer have basically two knees. This particular bone is in your ankle. In fact, it's two bones in your ankle. White-tailed deer, it's sort of the lower leg bone that articulates with the hoof. But in any case, what they've done is they've taken this, they've hollowed it out, and you can see the lines where they hollowed it out, and then they use it as a draw knife to process deer hides and other hides as well. Pretty interesting tool. Some sites, we find hundreds of these. And to me, it indicates that not only are they processing a whole lot of deer hides, but they're probably engaged in trading these deer hides for other commodities because they're producing so many. This is something you find on a lot of sites, and it's a eastern box turtle, and it's been hollowed out and made into a cup. The three highest collected animals on most sites is first the white-tailed deer, then the turkey, and the third animal is the box turtle. This is another type of artifact we find on prehistoric sites that I find fascinating, the use of the Virginia Indians of tobacco. During prehistoric times with Native Americans, it was something that was used only during certain ceremonies or religious activities. Here's a typical early late woodland pipe that made of clay, fired clay. Another example. You can see the bowls are quite small, so there's not a whole lot of tobacco being smoked, but again for religious or ceremonial reasons. As time went on and we hit the colonial period, something happened that was quite interesting, and you get pipes that are decorated like this. You can see the starburst pattern, which is quite unique. And this was something that happened during colonial times. The decorations are obviously made with colonial tools, but we're not sure exactly who the makers were. Some of these motifs go back into prehistoric times. We have quite a few artifacts here, guys, so if you want to come down and see some really neat stuff, here's the place you need to go.
The Weyanocks made their living partially by hunting and fishing and partially by farming. They were not nomads at all. They lived in towns, and right in amongst the houses were gardens in which they raised corn, beans, and squash. Europeans were not used to our corn at all and found it rather interesting and soon began buying it. The people who raised the corn shocked the Europeans because it was the women. Women were the farmers. It was the men who did the hunting and most of the fishing. But the farmland was controlled by the women. The women also built the houses, and they wanted a shorter commute to work each day, so they built the houses right close to the gardens. The location of towns then was decided upon by the women, because the women did the work in the town. The men were out. They wouldn't have had much say about where the town went. But the center of everything was the water, because everybody was in and out of the water. Water was also a major source of their food, with fish and shellfish of various kinds. So they were constantly going to the water just to get part of that night's supper. Water was central. They had to have waterfront towns. And for that reason, you find the maps showing Indian towns only along the rivers and some of the creeks. You don't find Indian towns way back away from the river. That was hunting territory. It was public hunting land. So you're not going to find Indian towns back there. The Weyanock Indians only appear for a few decades in the records in Virginia. This didn't mean that they got massacred by anybody. They didn't. It doesn't mean that they died out. They didn't. It means that they moved. They continued living on their James River land on both sides of the James River. Beautiful farmland there, by the way, some of the best in the state. The Indians knew how to find good farmland, but they had to move away from it. After the war with the English of 1644 to 46, the pressure the English could put on them by that time drove them away from James River, and they went clear down into northeastern North Carolina and settled briefly in a number of places, always on a creek bank, always in places that were claimed by somebody else. And eventually they simply gave the thing up and they merged with another tribe. The people they merged with were the Nottaways. When the Nottaways and the Weyanocks and some Nansomans took English names, which happened after 1700, then you have some of the Weyanock descendants taking the name Weyanoke. Weyanock, Weyanoke. And eventually that name died out, but the people would have had descendants. Eventually the Nottaways dispersed altogether, and there are Nottaway descendants all over the United States. And some of them have got some Weyanock ancestry.